The moment I saw water bleeding into the red dirt, I knew somebody had crossed a line they could never uncross. I shouted for them to stop, but the maintenance worker had already snapped my supply pipe clean in half, and standing 10 feet behind him was Evelyn Cross, president of the Silver Mesa Property Association, smiling like she had just won an election nobody else knew was happening. It was 101 degrees outside. My garden was dying by the minute, and that woman had just cut off the only water source to my home because I refused to pay $9,000 a year to an association I had never joined. My name is Walter Grady. I was 64 years old then, recently retired after 36 years designing water systems for counties all over central Arizona, and all I wanted from retirement was a quiet house, a few fruit trees, and enough decent soil to grow tomatoes that did not taste like wet cardboard. I owned 3 acres outside a little desert town called Red Hollow, land that had belonged to an old ranching family before the luxury development rose around it. And when I bought the place, my attorney made one thing very clear. My parcel was independent. No HOA covenant, no club membership, no shared amenities, no yearly assessments, nothing. That legal independence was one of the main reasons I bought it. I did not need a golf course, a spa, a wine room, or a heated pool shaped like a seashell. I needed peace, and for 7 years that was exactly what I had. Then Evelyn became board president. The first letter arrived in May, a glossy envelope with the Silver Mesa crest stamped across the top, informing me that my annual assessment of $9,000 was overdue. I laughed when I opened it because I assumed some new office clerk had mixed up a parcel number, so I mailed back a copy of my deed with a polite note explaining the mistake. 2 weeks later, another letter came, this one less polite, adding penalties and threatening collection. I responded again, this time by certified mail, and included the original subdivision map showing my property sitting outside the association boundary. Then came the third letter, signed by Evelyn herself, warning that continued noncompliance would result in suspension of community privileges and enforcement against my property. I called her office 3 times, left 3 messages, and never heard a word back. That should have told me something, but I still believe paperwork mattered to people who used words like covenant and compliance. Turns out Evelyn only cared about paperwork when it gave her power. That morning, I had been watering my peppers when the hose coughed twice and went limp in my hand. At first I thought the pump had failed, but then I heard a truck near the front drive and found 2 association workers standing beside the exposed supply line. One of them looked embarrassed. The other would not meet my eyes, and between them lay a fresh 6-inch gap in the pipe. Evelyn stood beside the truck in white slacks and oversized sunglasses, fanning herself with a bright orange violation notice. I asked her what in God's name she thought she was doing. She tilted her head and gave me that soft little smile people use when they are enjoying your anger. "Walter," she said, "you've ignored every reasonable attempt to resolve your debt, so the board authorized suspension of your utility access." I told her the line was on my land and the debt did not exist. She shrugged and said, "Actions have consequences." That sentence stayed with me, mostly because she said it like she had been waiting all month to use it. I stepped toward the pipe, and the younger worker quietly backed away. Evelyn did not. She leaned closer and told me the water would remain disconnected until I paid the full balance, including late fees, legal fees, and an administrative restoration charge. The total had somehow become $11,400. I asked if she understood that cutting water during an excessive heat warning could put a person in the hospital. She lowered her sunglasses just enough to look me in the eye and said, "Then I suggest you settle quickly." After they left, I stood there listening to the last drop soak into the dust while my garden sagged in the sun, and I felt something inside me go very still. I have never been a man who enjoys confrontation. My late wife, Carol, used to say I could negotiate with a rattlesnake if you gave me a clipboard and 10 minutes, but she also said there was a point where patience stopped being kindness and started becoming permission. Evelyn had found that point. I made 3 calls before noon. The first was to a plumber named Miguel Santos, a man I had trusted for years, but when I told him who had cut the line, he went silent. Finally, he admitted Silver Mesa held his largest maintenance contract, and Evelyn had already warned every local contractor not to work on my property without board approval. He sounded ashamed when he said he could not risk losing his crew's income. I told him I understood, though I did not. The second call was to the Regional Water Authority. where a woman named Denise explained that the public utility ended at a junction half a mile away, and everything beyond that point was considered privately managed infrastructure under an old development agreement. As far as the county was concerned, my water problem was a civil dispute. The third call was to my attorney, Samuel Reed, who confirmed what I already knew. The association had no legal right to charge me or cut my line, that getting an emergency injunction could still take weeks. Weeks, in that heat, felt like a death sentence for every living thing on my property. Samuel suggested I pay under protest and sue later. I looked out at the apricot tree Carol had planted before she died, its leaves curling at the edges, and told him I would think about it. That afternoon, I found flyers taped to mailboxes all along the county road, claiming a non-paying property owner was endangering the stability of the community water system. Evelyn never used my name, but she did not have to. By evening, neighbors were calling me selfish, irresponsible, even dangerous. One man I had helped repair a fence told me to stop acting special and pay my fair share. Nobody asked why my land was not part of the association. Nobody asked who had cut the pipe. They had been given a villain, and I was close enough to blame. After sunset, I sat alone on the porch with a warm bottle of water and watched the lights glow across Silver Mesa. The pool shining blue, sprinklers sweeping over the golf course, fountains bubbling in front of the clubhouse. Then I remembered something I had nearly forgotten. An old concrete vault, buried beneath mesquite brush near the north boundary of my land, a piece of abandoned infrastructure the previous owner had called a useless relic from the original development. I had never opened it, never had a reason to. But as I watched thousands of gallons flowing freely across Evelyn's perfect little kingdom, a possibility began forming in my mind, slow and cold and precise. At 5 the next morning, I carried a shovel, a pry bar, and 36 years of hydraulic experience into that brush, and when the concrete lid finally shifted, the sound it made was deep and heavy, like something old waking up beneath the ground. Inside that vault sat a cast-iron gate valve nearly 2 feet across, its wheel crusted orange with rust, its housing dark with old mineral stains. And running from it were 2 separate lines, one narrow pipe ending south toward my house and one thick 6-inch main disappearing east beneath the desert toward Silver Mesa. I crouched there in the cool, damp air below ground level, staring at it while the morning heat began crawling over the rocks above me, and for a few seconds I just listened to the faint vibration humming through the metal, steady and powerful. Thousands of gallons moving beneath my hand toward the same people who had cut me dry. I did not touch the wheel, not yet, because anger makes men reckless and engineering teaches you that reckless men usually become examples in safety manuals. So I photographed everything, measured the vault, marked the pipe directions, and called the one person I trusted to tell me whether I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. His name was Calvin Moore, a retired county surveyor with bad knees, an old straw hat, and the irritating habit of being right before everybody else. He arrived 2 hours later with a GPS receiver, rolled maps, and a cooler full of ice water, looked down into the vault, then looked at me and said, "Well, Walter, either you found the heart of Silver Mesa or the world's ugliest wishing well." We spent the morning walking a property line, checking pins, comparing modern coordinates with the original subdivision plat, and by 11 Calvin had an answer. The valve was 27 feet inside my deeded boundary, not near it, not disputed, not sitting on some fuzzy shared strip, but squarely and undeniably on my land. More importantly, there was no recorded easement granting Silver Mesa access to the valve, no utility lease, no maintenance agreement, and no right of entry. Calvin tapped the map with one thick finger and told me the original developer had gone bankrupt in 2001, sold the acreage in pieces, and apparently forgotten that the master water control vault had ended up on the parcel later sold to me. I asked him the question carefully. If I secure that valve, am I breaking the law? He rubbed his chin, glanced at the pipe, and said, "I am not your lawyer, but I can tell you this much. They have been using infrastructure on your property without recorded permission, and yesterday they physically severed your private branch line. If you shut it down to inspect, protect, or control unauthorized use, they can sue and a judge can sort it out. But I doubt the sheriff is going to drag you away in handcuffs for locking equipment you own." Then he smiled, and Calvin did not smile often, which made it more unsettling. "I think your neighbor has been playing poker without realizing you own the table." That afternoon I drove into town and started collecting paper, because paper does not shout, does not panic, and does not forget what people said after they hire attorneys. At the county records office, I pulled the original development filings, the bankruptcy sale, water system diagrams, and Silver Mesa's current corporate registration. That was where the situation stopped being a simple property dispute and started smelling like something rotten under fresh paint. Silver Mesa was not legally registered as a commercial resort, even though it advertised guest villas online for $500 a night, hosted destination weddings, sold spa packages, and rented the clubhouse to corporations. On paper, it was a nonprofit residential association offering temporary guest accommodations to members. The money from those rentals did not appear to flow into the association accounts, either. It went to a private company called Cross Hospitality Services, owned by Evelyn and her younger brother, Martin. I sat at a public terminal scrolling through records, feeling that same cold clarity I used to feel when a system diagram revealed a hidden pressure failure. Evelyn had been forcing homeowners to subsidize maintenance, landscaping, water treatment, and staff while she collected the profitable side to her own company. The $9,000 she demanded from me was not about fairness. It was about obedience and cash flow. And she had cut my water because she believed fear would be cheaper than litigation. I went home and drafted a notice myself. Samuel cleaned up 2 sentences over the phone, but otherwise told me to send it exactly as written. It stated that the master water valve located on my private property was being used without a recorded easement or lease, that my residential line had been intentionally damaged by association agents, and that I would conduct an emergency security and integrity inspection of all water infrastructure on my land after 72 hours. During that period, Silver Mesa could restore my service, provide proof of legal access, and begin negotiations for continued use. I sent copies by certified mail to Evelyn, every board member, the county water authority, the sheriff's office, and my attorney. I also emailed photographs, maps, and the video of the cut pipe. Then I waited. Evelyn did not call. Instead, the next morning, another notice appeared on my gate threatening fines for interference with community utilities. By afternoon, 2 security guards in khaki uniforms parked outside my property and photographed me whenever I stepped onto the porch. That evening, Evelyn finally sent a 3-line email saying the board rejected my fraudulent claims and would pursue all legal remedies if I tampered with association property. She called the Valve Association property even though it was 27 feet inside my land, and that told me she had no intention of negotiating until consequences reached her door. On the final night of the deadline, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the residents who had children, older people on medication, families who did not know what Evelyn had done, and I knew shutting off that line would affect more than her. That was the part nobody sees when they tell stories about revenge. The moment when you realize the person who hurt you has wrapped innocent people around themselves like armor. I considered backing down, paying the money, letting Samuel fight it slowly in court. But then I walked outside with a flashlight and saw Carol's apricot tree drooping in the dark, and beneath it, the dry irrigation trench where water should have been running. Evelyn had counted on my conscience stopping me after hers had failed. I decided I would give the residents one more chance. At dawn, I posted copies of my notice at the roadside mail station and sent it to every email address I could find in the association directory. I explained that water service could be interrupted because the board had damaged my line and refused to negotiate access to the master valve on my property. I included the deed map and invited anyone with medical needs to contact me so I could provide bottled water from the emergency supply I purchased. By 6:30, my phone was ringing. Most people accused me of lying, but 3 residents called quietly, asked questions, and admitted they had never seen the easement Evelyn claimed existed. One of them was Harold Briggs, the association treasurer, a soft-spoken widower who had served on the board for 9 years. He said Evelyn had stopped sharing complete financial statements with him and that he had been considering resigning. I told him about Cross Hospitality Services. There was a long silence. Then he asked me to send every record I had found. At 7:15, with the 72 hours officially expired, I carried a pipe wrench, penetrating oil, a chain, an industrial lock, and a camera to the vault. I recorded the date, the location, the property markers, and the condition of both lines. Then I sprayed the valve stem, waited, and fitted the wrench onto the wheel. The first pull did nothing. The second sent a sharp pain through my shoulder. On the third, the rust cracked with a sound like a rifle shot and the wheel moved half an inch. I leaned into it again, feeling every year in my back. And slowly the old gate began descending inside the pipe. The vibration changed beneath my boots. First a heavy rush, then a hiss, then a fading tremor that disappeared completely when the valve seated shut. The desert became strangely quiet. I looped the chain through the wheel, locked it to the frame, and placed a weatherproof sign beside the vault stating private property. Unauthorized access prohibited. Infrastructure under documented inspection. Then I walked back to the porch, poured coffee, and watched Silver Mesa wake up without water. At 7:30, the golf course sprinklers rose from the grass and sprayed nothing. At 8, the fountain outside the clubhouse coughed brown foam and stopped. By 8:45, cars were pulling up to the main entrance, guests carrying luggage, robes, and wet hair, all demanding answers. I could hear distant shouting carried across the dry ground, and from my porch I watched employees running between buildings with buckets like people aboard a sinking ship. My first call came from a father named Daniel Price, one of the men who had called me selfish. His voice was tight because his daughter needed water for a medical device. I told him there were sealed containers waiting at my gate, and he could take as much as he needed. He arrived 10 minutes later, avoided my eyes, loaded the water, then quietly said he was sorry. By 10, the clubhouse kitchen had closed. The pool filters were losing prime. The wedding coordinator was arguing with a bride's mother in the parking lot, and the front desk line had stretched out the door. At 10:26, Evelyn called. She did not say hello. "Turn it back on," she snapped. I asked what she was referring to. "Do not be cute with me, Walter. You have shut down water to 200 people in a functioning resort." I reminded her that Silver Mesa was registered as a non-profit residential amenity, not a resort. There was a pause, small but noticeable. Then she told me I was committing extortion and endangering lives. I said I had delivered water to every resident who requested it, and that the association was welcome to restore my pipe, present a valid easement, and negotiate a legal access agreement. She said the sheriff was already coming and that I would be arrested for sabotage. I told her I would leave the coffee warm. 25 minutes later, Sheriff Lucas Warren drove up my lane with Evelyn following in a black SUV, and the look on her face told me she still believed authority would save her from facts. Lucas stepped onto my porch, removed his hat, and said, "Mr. Grady, I have been told you are holding an entire community hostage." I handed him the deed, Calvin's survey, the certified notices, photographs of my severed line, and the county record showing no easement. Evelyn tried to interrupt before he had finished reading. He raised one hand and told her to wait. She did not like that. After 10 quiet minutes, Lucas looked toward the vault, then at Evelyn, and asked who had ordered my pipe cut. Evelyn said the board had authorized suspension of service. Lucas asked whether she had a court order. She said they did not need one because the association controlled the system. He held up my deed and said, "The valve is on his property. The branch line was on his property, and you entered his land to cut it. Right now, this looks less like sabotage and more like a civil dispute you escalated without legal authority." Her face went red beneath her makeup. She demanded that he force me to open the valve. Lucas told her he had no basis to do that. Then he turned to me and said I was not being arrested, but I should expect lawsuits, threats, and people making very bad decisions before sunset. I told him I already had. As he walked back to his cruiser, Evelyn stepped close enough that I could smell her perfume and whispered, "You are going to regret humiliating me." I looked at the dry fountain behind her and said, "Evelyn, I think we passed regret yesterday." By noon, the resort had begun issuing refunds. The wedding was canceled, and residents were gathering outside the clubhouse in the heat. Then Harold Briggs called me, breathing hard, and said he had opened the financial files Evelyn kept locked away. He had found transfers, false invoices, and nearly $300,000 missing from the reserve account. He said there would be an emergency board meeting that evening, and this time, whether Evelyn liked it or not, the truth was coming with him. The emergency meeting started at 7 that evening inside the Silver Mesa clubhouse. Though by then, the place looked less like a luxury retreat and more like an overheated airport after every flight had been canceled. The air conditioning was still running, but without water, the bathrooms were closed. The kitchen was dark, and 200 angry residents had packed themselves into a room designed for half that number. I was not invited, which did not surprise me, but Harold had his phone in his shirt pocket with the call connected. So I sat on my porch in the fading light and listened. Evelyn opened the meeting by calling me unstable, vindictive, and dangerous. She said I had manipulated an old property map, sabotaged essential infrastructure, and put children and elderly residents at risk to force the board into paying me. For the first few minutes, some people believed her. I could hear voices shouting that I should be arrested, that the sheriff was protecting me, that somebody should cut the lock and reopen the valve. Then Daniel Price stood up, the same man whose daughter needed the medical device, and told the room that I had provided his family with water when the association had provided nothing. He said Evelyn had cut my line first, without a judge, without a hearing, and without even verifying whether I belonged to the association. The room went quieter after that. Then Harold walked to the front. He sounded nervous, but there was steel underneath it. He said he had reviewed the bank records, vendor contracts, and reserve accounts, and that nearly $300,000 had been transferred over 4 years to companies controlled by Evelyn and her brother. He named Cross Hospitality Services, Desert Crest Landscaping, and a consulting firm that existed only as a rented mailbox in Phoenix. The room exploded. Evelyn accused him of stealing confidential documents. Harold answered that he was the elected treasurer and had every right to see them. Then he asked the question that finally broke her control. If Silver Mesa is not a commercial resort, why are private guests paying hundreds of dollars a night? And where is that money going? Nobody yelled for several seconds. That silence was worse for Evelyn than any accusation. She started talking too fast, explaining that the guest revenue supported community programming and that the companies were legitimate vendors. A woman near the front asked why the reserve fund was almost empty when homeowners had been paying thousands every year. A retired accountant asked why the same invoice numbers appeared twice. Somebody else asked why board members had never voted on contracts with Evelyn's brother. Every answer created 3 more questions. By the time Harold held up the photograph of my cut pipe and asked who authorized the crew to enter private land, Evelyn had lost the room. She slammed her hand on the table and shouted that nobody understood what it took to run a community like Silver Mesa, that she had built its reputation, increased property values, brought in weddings, corporate events, and wealthy guests. That was the moment she admitted it was a business. You could hear people reacting before she even realized what she had said. Harold asked whether she had reported that income to the county or the state. Evelyn looked toward the side door. One of the homeowners noticed and moved in front of it. I do not know whether anyone intended to physically stop her, but the image of 100 furious people between her and freedom must have changed her plans, because she grabbed her purse, pushed through a service hallway, and left through the kitchen. Her SUV peeled out of the parking lot 5 minutes later. By sunrise the next morning, Harold and 3 newly appointed board members were standing at my gate. They looked exhausted, embarrassed, and sterile, though. Harold told me Evelyn had emailed her resignation at 2 in the morning, blamed the board for creating a hostile environment, and disappeared. He asked what it would take to restore service. I handed him a written agreement Samuel and I had prepared. Silver Mesa would repair my water line that day using a licensed plumber of my choice. The association would acknowledge in writing that my property was not part of the HOA and would waive any present or future claim for dues, fines, or assessments. They would lease the valve and access corridor for me for $1 a year for 99 years, but I would retain ownership and the right to supervise all maintenance. They would reimburse the cost of my legal consultation, replace the trees and garden plants lost during the outage, and fund an independent forensic audit available to every homeowner. I also required the board to create an emergency water plan so no president could ever use basic utilities as a weapon again. Harold read every page. Unlike the original story people later told, nobody signed without looking. They asked questions, called their attorney, changed 2 sentences, and then signed on the hood of Harold's truck. That mattered to me. I was not trying to become the next Evelyn. Power does strange things to people, especially when they convince themselves they are using it for justice. Miguel arrived before noon with his crew and repaired my line free of charge, though I insisted the association pay his full invoice. When the cement set and the pressure test passed, we all walked to the vault. I removed the chain, fitted the wrench onto the wheel, and turned it slowly counterclockwise. At first there was only a faint metallic groan. Then the pipe beneath us shuddered and water surged east with a deep rolling vibration across the valley. Sprinklers rose from the golf course like little metal flowers. The clubhouse fountain coughed, spat brown water, then cleared into a bright stream. Somewhere in the distance, people began cheering. I did not. I stood with my hand on the valve and felt relief mixed with something heavier, because for 2 days I had controlled whether an entire neighborhood had water, and even though I believed I was right, that kind of control should make any decent person uncomfortable. The audit took 6 weeks. It found false contracts, personal expenses disguised as maintenance, unpaid lodging taxes, and $287,000 missing from association accounts. The county shut down the guest operation for zoning and sanitation violations. State investigators seized records. The tax authorities froze cross-hospitality services, and Evelyn was arrested 3 months later at a rental house outside Tucson. She eventually pleaded guilty to fraud and tax evasion, though the case over the waterline never reached trial. Silver Mesa could not survive the debt. The bank took the clubhouse and guest villas. The golf course closed, and the property was sold in pieces. A nonprofit converted the villas into senior housing. The clubhouse became a public library and community center. Most of the golf course returned to desert grass, mesquite, and walking trails. My apricot tree survived. The one side never fully recovered. The tomatoes were gone, but the peppers came back so aggressively that I spent the fall giving them to every neighbor who had once called me selfish. Some apologized. Some acted as though they had supported me all along. People are funny that way. Today, the valve remains in its concrete vault beneath a locked wooden shelter. The new water cooperative pays me $1 every January, usually taped inside a card with a joke about never making the engineer angry. I laugh, but the truth is I do not think the lesson is that I was clever or that Evelyn deserved everything that happened. The real question is how far a person is allowed to go when the system is too slow to protect them. I shut off water to innocent families to stop one powerful woman from using that same water as a weapon against me. I gave warnings, supplied emergency containers, and had the law on my side. But does that make it right, or only understandable? Tell me what you would have done. Would you have paid the money and fought later, turned the valve like I did, or found another way before the whole community got dragged into the battle? Leave your judgment in the comments. Share this with someone who has dealt with an out-of-control HOA. And remember, knowing your rights matters, but knowing what you are willing to do with them matters even more.